talked about Saratoga being up here on the Hudson. And why is this such a big deal? Why is this particular battle such a big deal?
Because of the French.
It's the needed win that the French, man, the French are going through all kinds of problems. They're running 150% deficits. So the French king is not particularly enthusiastic about the idea of helping a country overthrow a monarchy, but it is the British, so why not? So know this battle, and then how it leads Franklin to have kind of leverage to get this treaty. And it is the first treaty with any country, and the American people. This treaty, by the way, is going to come back to haunt us a little bit later. Anybody guess when? Anybody get? But the treaty is a good treaty. We work out a smart treaty. But it's a treaty of like friendship, but and military. But why is this maybe problematic for the future? Well, maybe not quite that far ahead. I'm trying to think. It didn't really. The French were an element in the War of 1812, but not a huge factor. Not this treaty either. So we don't usually see treaties run in a way that are temporary. And so by that I mean, like, if you think about the Grand Alliance, it's called, between us and Britain, it's lasted for like a century, right? World War I, World War II, all it current. NATO, a permanent treaty organization, North Atlantic Treaty. But this treaty of perpetual friendship is going to be claimed by the French revolutionaries in 1790s. And they'll be like, y'all need to come help us. We have a treaty, right? And George Washington's like, nah, we're a neutral country. And so I was asking my own kids, my boys, about treaties. Is it the beauty of a country to honor a treaty if it doesn't benefit that country? Well, wouldn't most people say that? Like, in other words, did France benefit theoretically from this treaty? A war with Britain. Did America benefit from this treaty? A war with Britain. But later on, George Washington is going to issue sort of a politics of reality, kind of a Bismarck kind of phrase here. When the revolutionaries come to get help, he's like, well, we didn't make that treaty with you, and it's not in our interest to fight right now.
I forgot. My mom wanted to text her so I can, just so she knows I got here safely. I forgot before I got out of the car. Yeah.
Where are you coming from?
8. She just wants to make sure that I did.
Yeah. What time? Not normally, but yeah, today. What time y'all? Is this what time you're gonna get here?
About.
All right. So here's what's happening after the Battle of Saratoga. Okay. So keep in mind where the British are mostly camped out is outside of Philadelphia, right, and New York. Let me go back and find the map. So this is General Howe right here. And here's New Jersey. Here's New York. So after the Battle of Long Island, and Battle of New York, George Washington retreats here all the way across the Delaware River. So like through New Jersey, because New York was like a loyalist stronghold, lots of loyalist types. New Jersey, mixed bag. Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is right here. So this is where the Congress is meeting. Although Howe, when he attacked, they had to move away. The Congress goes out in the countryside. So he's wintering here, and it's within like a couple day meet of Philadelphia, but he's also can keep his eye on Howe. He's got a group of spies that are giving him information. So he's camped there, and it's during that winter that von Steuben shows up and starts to really train Washington's men. Like turns them into full-blown soldiers. Keep in mind, up to this point, they're like militia. You see up there at the top. Yeah. See how they're like militiamen? But this is where I think George Washington becomes legendary, because he chooses, and that's Lafayette. Remember him? He, Lafayette, Hamilton, they choose to stay there with the men. So we're talking about frostbite, famous expressions like blood footprints in the snow, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So at this point, Hal, we think, based on what I've read, you remember where Hal is. Hal gets kind of bored of winter fighting. He doesn't want to do, or not bored, but averse to like who wants to fight in winter time. He apparently enjoys New York life quite a bit. All right, and so this kind of stalls. So this phase one of the Brits was up here, right? And that failed, okay, particularly because of the Battle of Saratoga. Phase two doesn't really go anywhere. Okay, they're just kind of hanging around, and mostly just little like expeditions out to capture the Continental Congress or something. But they decided to send a new army, and you can see here's Cornwallis and Clinton. These guys were commanders in the northern campaign, but they say let's relocate them to be what is considered the soft underbelly of the colonies. So, like, think of this as their southern strategy. So the northern strategy didn't work. The middle colonies really aren't doing much. So if we roll up, he says, he being in this case Cornwallis, see him up there. We roll up from where we already have, which are these port cities, right? They take the ports almost right away. And so once they get Charleston, they're going to and keep lots of South Carolinians around here were loyalists. One of the two places where the loyalists hung out a lot. And so they start chasing through the upcountry the rebels, as they call them. Keep in mind, this is a mixture of militia and a southern colonial army. Now, this is where Benedict Arnold gets angry, for example. He doesn't get promoted to being command of the southern army. So you're going to see that you have victories here and here. These two victories are primarily, though, y'all, Cowpens and Kings Mountain against loyalists. It's like Civil War battles, Americans fighting Americans. So Cowpens, and then right on the border, it's actually over in North Carolina, is Kings Mountain. I've been to the campground. They got a nice campground. You camp on the lake and stuff like that. It's right outside of Charlotte. If you go west of Charlotte, it's about 20 minutes. So right in this area, they're fighting. But the person they're fighting against, I've got some information here about what else is going on in Virginia. So you can see here, by 1781, but it's there's two different things happening. You've got fighting here, and you also have you remember the Norfolk got overtaken. So you have a British army trying to get the Virginia rebels caught. So up top, they're trying to capture the rebels. Here in Virginia, they're trying to capture. And they come for Jefferson. And so the Virginia militia was in Charlottesville. See the date here. This fellow, Jack Jewett, was on the lawn, and he observed a bunch of these guys. So y'all seen The Patriot? The movie The Patriot? The bad guy in The Patriot is named Bannister Tarleton. All right. Bannister Tarleton is he commands dragoons. They're like cavalry officers. But when they come into a town, they would burn all the people in a church for you. Lock them in the church and set on fire. They kill civilians. So he was waging what we might think of as total war. The Tarleton is coming to get Jefferson. All right. General Assembly, Virginia General Assembly meeting there. Now, our new governor, Jefferson, he leaves up north and comes down. Patrick Henry was our first governor. Jefferson was our second governor. All right. And the rebels so they're coming to capture the Virginia rebels. And if it had not been for this fella coming to warn them, Jack Jewett, he being Tarleton, would have captured all these guys. All right. So this was a key moment where it just tells you that the Brits are still working under what operational mindset. Like if I'm battling troops, what's the best way to stop a war? Well, that's our tactic, perhaps, like survive. But if I'm the British and I want to end this rebellion, what's the way to do it?
Capture the people who started it.
That's right. Good. Capture the people who started it. So, like when we went after Al Qaeda, it was mostly the command and conquer from, we want their command structure knocked out. We want to kill the ground troops too, so to speak. But really, you know, taking out the big dogs is probably their theory is the quickest way to end it. Keep in mind the position the British have is one of that ordinary people are being brainwashed, right? You know, being manipulated to follow these people. So Britain then, like I said, they do have some wins, but unfortunately for them, good for us, they can't stop the, in other words, like they come into these communities, they round up what they consider ringleaders that are there, but the rest of the people melt into the woods. Very similar to the Viet Cong, you know, except we're not communists. All right. And we had a couple really skilled generals. Now this is the fighting Quaker. General Greene comes down, and this is the one that Arnold wanted the gig of. Benedict Arnold wanted this assignment. But he's like the Washington of the South, if that makes sense. And here, that's when Arnold decides to quit. And so today in American history, if you hear somebody say Benedict Arnold, you normally think of a synonym for traitor. You know, like that's a traitorous person. So Arnold is he's in New York, and he decides to try to sell West Point, which is like a fort on the Hudson River. Not successful at it, but nonetheless, he's going to end up, this was probably one of our biggest heroes going over to Britain, and literally going to Britain after the war is over. Washington says, by God, if they can get Arnold, they can get any of us. You know? But here you see Washington and Greene are the two sort of Southern leaders now. Washington is a commander over the entire army, but he is sort of almost locked into that location outside of Valley Forge. Okay, so Greene is going to have the difficult task of commanding militia and regular soldiers at the same time, but he is helped ably by this fella who's right here. This is Francis Marion, who's called the Swamp Fox. So if you go back to this, Marion County is down in South Carolina. The name Francis Marion is really popular, but as Cornwallis is going deeper and deeper into the interior, right? So as he goes up these rivers, and the rivers make life difficult for him, but there's swamps all around you, really swampy territory in middle South Carolina. So what happens is Marion, who becomes known in history as the Swamp Fox, will sneak out, and he's using a sort of ragtag, hellion group of soldiers as his guerrillas. And here he captures entire Cornwallis' supply train, and he also captures British officers. The movie The Patriot is about him. So he is the Francis Marion character. Okay. Now that brings us to local issue. So one of my friends, his name is Larry Aaron, did a book here for us called The Crossing at the Dam. And it's the other very famous crossing, he called it. The second most important, was the first most important crossing?
Oh,
Delaware, right? When Washington does it. But here, if you can tell this line, it's Byrd Survey Line, which is the border of Virginia and North Carolina. All right. And here you'll see a place called Dix's Ferry. That's Danville, old Danville, Dix's Ferry, right? Before it was Danville. Okay. And the Dan River was part of the Stanton River, it comes down here. So you can see for the Brits, river crossings are their most important difficulty. Because you're vulnerable when you cross a river, especially wide rivers like the Dan, because you got to have like barges to cross. Okay. So if you come back here, Cornwallis is pursuing General Greene, among others, through the South. And you can see they're doing this, and this is where these loyalist battles are between us and them. Cornwallis will catch up. But here he's headed north towards Virginia, right, and chasing the rebel army. And that's, if you look right there, that's where the Battle of Guilford Courthouse takes place. Now, y'all know where Guilford County is? Greensboro, North Carolina. So y'all heard of the street in Greensboro called Battleground Avenue? That's this. That's this battle. So they do reenactments here even now down that road. You can go see guys in revolutionary uniforms and stuff. So what happens is Cornwallis is pursuing. Here's the town of Hillsborough. Maybe you know where that is. Okay, Hillsborough. Down 86, you're headed to North Carolina, Duke, Durham. And he's coming this way, okay? And he's pursuing General Greene. Okay. Greene, as you see, actually has him what? Outnumbered. But Cornwallis is able to trap one group and then knock out the other, and Greene's men have to retreat. So then you have this race to the Dan River. Okay? So they're racing here. And when they get here, they stop and they bury some of their dead. The road will become known in history as Bury Hill. All right, now they've since renamed it from its kind of gross name, B-U-R-Y, now B-E-R-R-Y, right? But that's where people who were killed in this battle are buried. And they get to the Dan River, and Greene confiscates all the flat-bottom boats. He seizes all of them and brings his entire army across the river. So that when Cornwallis gets here, he can't cross. All the crossing, because it's horses and people, they're not going to wade across it. Like I stood at the Dan River, you're not going to wade across it. You know, so this stops Cornwallis from capturing Greene's army. Remember, the strategy of the revolution isn't necessarily win big victories, it's don't get beaten. You know, don't lose like terribly. So with this, Cornwallis has to go backwards, all the way back to Wilmington. It's the next closest port, slows him down, right? Meanwhile, our army coordinates up here. Washington starts to come down. Now, he does move up about the same time they were trying to capture Charlottesville. But the problem for Cornwallis throughout this whole period is he's always getting hit from behind. You know, like his supply train is getting disrupted. So once he gets up here and they fail to capture the House of Burgess, and they fail to capture Patrick Henry and Jefferson, he moves back here to wait for resupplies, Yorktown. So you'll notice the year, right? So he's gotten all the way up here, and now he's waiting for supplies. And that's when the French come in. All right, thank goodness for the French. All right. So this was a good defeat for us. I mean, you can have a good defeat, but this is called the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. They held up. Keep in mind, most of Greene's men are undisciplined militia. You know, they're guys like Francis Marion's dudes, so they're not like British forces. You know, and these aren't the same guys who got trained by Von Steuben. They're up in the northern part. So what happens is the French arrive. Okay, a guy named the Count de Rochambeau. His French forces meet with Washington's forces. Washington believes, rightfully, that Howe's not going to leave New York. So he and Rochambeau come down his familiar territory. That's his house, right there. Coming, okay? So they come back through here. Cornwallis has set up here. So at this point, Rochambeau, and particularly Washington, this is where Hamilton, you know, attacks the rampart. They've got him cornered. And for the only time in the war, the French have won a naval battle, really, over the Brits. Keep in mind, the Brits are like the superior naval force. All right, and the French have kind of scurried the British force away, the naval force. So the French have this. So they control the Chesapeake. Washington arrives with Rochambeau. By the way, you already have moving in from that General Morgan and General Greene's forces. And so Cornwallis is completely surrounded and cut off. And this is the bulk of the British Army. So when that happens, the expression is Cornwallis said the whole world has turned upside down. You know. Now, Washington, Cornwallis is so embarrassed, so ashamed, he won't even he won't come out to surrender his sword. That's the thing to do, right? He sends an assistant. So Washington then sends one of his assistants. You know, like, but they surrender here. Okay, the Brits surrender to the Americans, and that's the bulk of the force in America. That's not all of it, but this, for your sake, you should mark on your study guide or something. And by the way, whenever I do these lectures, I'm always encouraging you guys to write down, you know, answers to stuff that you hear. That means less stuff you have to look up later. Okay. And keep in mind, I did not discuss much with you at all about the role of Catherine the Great or the role of Chief Joseph Brant. So some of this stuff you have to get from the reading, everybody. Okay, I can't narrate the entire history of the war. Some of it's reading and signing. Okay, so at the time, Franklin was already in Paris. He had been there the whole time. Remember, it was about the Continental Congress had sent John Adams to keep an eye on Franklin. because they were concerned that Franklin might be too much of a Francophile, like too friendly with the French. John Adams couldn't stand the French. So, here's Adams looking kind of annoyed. John Jay, future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Franklin's son, William Franklin, Temple Franklin. So they're there, coincidentally, right after the defeat down there at Yorktown here in our state. So they began negotiating a treaty with the Brits, even though it's in Paris. And here's the catch, y'all. The Brits realized that they need to do something smart with this treaty because the French are going to try to rip off the Americans. So the British actually start making separate agreement with the Americans, separate from the French. And they agree to cede them all that territory. All the territory of the Mississippi River. That's like a huge deal. Like we don't get Canada, but we get everything to the Mississippi in the Treaty of Paris. So there's a second Treaty of Paris. Remember the first one? Did it what? Yeah. So the French and Indian War ended in Paris. This war ends in Paris. Technically, the war doesn't end until '83. The Brits will finally leave New York. That's the last place they were. Remember New York? That day is still celebrated in New York City. It's called Evacuation Day. And it's the day the Brits evacuated New York, Manhattan, and Washington entered the city. You can see there. So by 1783, the war is over. And so even though Yorktown is in 1781, all right, the war kind of drags on, mostly just not serious fighting after it. So what's the last major battle? What's the first major battle? Bunker Hill, yeah. And so some students might say the battle at Concord, but really, we might call that a skirmish. Lexington, we might call that they ran from getting shot at. All right, so not really a battle hardly at all. But we're going to go from Bunker Hill to Yorktown. Okay. So why did the British lose? Big question. What was their reason? Or reasons? What are some conclusions, y'all?
Cornwallis never got supplies.
All right, so fighting over a huge landmass with extended supply lines is difficult. Napoleon will discover that. Like not really good, especially in enemy territory, where your supply lines are really frequently disrupted. But Cornwallis is just an army in the Revolution. Why else do the British lose? I mean, you're not wrong. That's a tactical reason. I don't disagree with it.
British soldiers actually wanted to get the colony back.
Well, the British soldiers, by and large, from what I've read, depending on who they were at best lukewarm. Now, some of the British officers were highly motivated to gain land. So they thought at the end of the war, when they won, Tarleton was like this. He wanted a 1,000-acre estate in Ohio. So they envisioned becoming like successful like landowners, But no, you're not wrong to say that the soldiers were not particularly motivated. I don't think that's the thing you most need to think about. One reason why the Treaty of Paris is so nice is the Whigs were in charge that negotiated. So a lesson of history is do not lead a divided people into war, especially a war that's 3,000 miles away. So in other words, a lot of the British people were not supportive of the war. Like, period. Why else, though, would this be difficult?
Like Vietnam.
Totally like Vietnam. Like, the analogies of Vietnam, I'm not overstating. Like, there are lots and lots of similarities. This is called Britain's Vietnam for a reason. Like the distance, the difficulty in supplying, fighting people on their home turf, divided nation, poor military decisions. I mean, really, there was, between President Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and the generals in charge, there were poor military decisions made. Well, there are poor military decisions here. Howe screws up. Remember, Howe doesn't go northward; he goes southward. So as much as you hear about the British military, they didn't do that. Secondly, their one greatest advantage militarily is Navy.
Oh, yeah.
This is not a naval war. It's not a war you're going to win on land with boats. Some of their other biggest advantages, population. Well, that's over there. Economic was probably the closest they came. Like, I think had the war dragged on and public opinion not have shifted, then the American people would have gone broke. Like they could would have started it. That would have started happening. Especially once Tarleton started burning like cornfields. You know what I mean? Like scorched earth. Yeah. But in the end, I think it has most to do with the will to keep fighting. Because keep in mind, if you do look in your, well, not here, look in your book, but you guys looking at home, mentioning this idea, whenever the biggest power in Europe gets in a fight, all the other powers are interested in seeing them lose, right? You know. So while the French overtly were at war with Britain, if you read about the neutrals in Europe, including Spain, Holland, they joined the war against Britain. And then Russia led something called armed neutrality, so that saying, I wouldn't help Britain. In other words, they basically stopped helping Britain by trading with Britain. So Britain became on its own like an island. Okay? All right. Yeah, remember what I told you, man, that they got all of that right there. So America didn't go from being the 13 colonies, it was all of this. And that's going to lead to having to solve some issues later on in Canada, particularly.
So was the I think it's the Spanish-American War. Was that the one we got Florida from? Or
we're going to get Florida by coercing the Spanish to sell it in 1819.
oh,
So what happens is James Monroe is president, and Andrew Jackson is the governor of Tennessee, and he's also the militia commander, he's like a general. And runaway slaves and Indians and Spanish are coordinating together. And so he invades Spanish Florida and wins. And so at that point, James Monroe's Secretary of State, a guy named John Quincy Adams, tells the Spanish, you either sell it to us or we're going to take it. And so that becomes the Adams-Onis Treaty, or the Florida Purchase Treaty. Now, the Spanish-American War is in 1898, and that involves Cuba and the Philippines. That's those two. We don't gain territory, permanent territory. Well, I think about it. We still have Guam and American Samoa, so we gain some territory. So that concludes our notes today. I have chapter 8 quiz ready for you guys to go after lunch. I want to see if there's anything that you guys online or working in here, either one, need as far as clarity on the reading. Anything that you guys like elaborated? Nope.
Could you explain like what was going on in phase 2, like why they like switch like from north to like going
Why?
to
How? Oh, you mean why they switched from New England?
Yeah.
All right. So if you look at Saratoga, remember the year?
Yes, sir. I can't exactly remember.
All right. Well, it's 1777, late.
Yeah.
And if you look at the battle, you're going to see that it was really devastating in terms of that northern campaign. So that strategy gets so disrupted that it becomes pretty clear. If you look over here, this is what they had intended to do, like a 3-pronged attack. And that's why I said Howe screwed up. Rather, see here, from the south never materialized due to miscommunication. Howe sent his army to Philadelphia. So when you have Burgoyne lose an entire army up there, all right, then that basically kills the plan. So what they calculate is that that's too difficult to try to go that way. In other words, it's not effective enough of a strategy to like, in other words, the fighting is not going to be there anymore. They make that fateful decision to say, let's go where the Congress is, okay, instead. So, I don't know exactly which general was. I know Howe screwed it up, but I don't know exactly who made the plan to switch. But I can look here real quick and see. Burgoyne's army was to march to Boston, whose ships would transport it back to England. There's the word they're reaching Franklin, and So the strategy altogether was attacked. Lord North's strategy didn't work. It's interesting to point out here that they had proposed peace, but it would not have been independence, so they rejected that. I would guess, based on what I've read enough of, y'all in duplicate mode. Sorry, I wouldn't be able to show you all of that. What I would guess, buddy, is that it was so unpopular, the failure, and Hal should have, gotten the blame for it. But the point is that after this, they decide to focus on really Philadelphia. So let me look at 3 phases of the American Revolution. Yeah. Oh no, that's different. Let's do a race. Here we go. Just as I would have called it, the New England phase, middle phase, and the southern phase. After Saratoga, Hal turned in his resignation. Okay, I thought something happened to Hal. So Hal had to quit. Okay. And then that's when they tried the southern strategy. Fair enough?
Yes, sir.
All right. Anybody else? Saratoga was a big deal, man. Like, it was the turning point. Oh, I'm still recording. Sorry.